Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. I'm going to take a detour off the common video path with this one and get back more to the channel's roots, helping other small farmers. And the subject of this video is, are small farms dying? And as you'll see, I think the answer is yes and no. First, we need to come to a common understanding of what a small farm is, because there's a difference between small farms and homestead. A small farm is a commercial operation that's selling their products to the public, and typically a small farm is supporting a family or an individual with a smaller amount of production because they're charging a higher price than a person would pay at the supermarkets, and they're making more of a profit, more of a percentage of profit on everything they sell. And finally, they're marketing directly to the consumer. Those are the key aspects, I think, of a small farm. And a small farm is different from a homestead in that a small farm is primarily producing for others and then feeding their family off the excess, while a homestead is primarily producing for themselves and selling the excess. With that common understanding, are small farms becoming a thing of the past? Well, let's go inside. I'll draw you some pictures and we'll get into it. Here's the way I think that farms and our food supply system works, at least in industrial countries. It's kind of a stupid, simple graph. If this axis of the graph is volume, in other words, food volume, percentage of food supply, and this axis is time, and we'll say that this side, I gotta look at my cheat sheet here, is looking to the past, and this end is looking forward or looking future. Then the middle of the graph is the present. Here's how our food supply distribution is. It's a simple bell curve like that. I used to use dopey graphs like this all the time in my old job. So presently, the vast majority of our food supply, at least in industrialized, developed countries, comes from the most common farming method, which people call industrial farms, for lack of a better word. Industrial in that they've industrialized a lot of the processes. They've eliminated a lot of the hand labor, automated a lot of it. It still depends on people and families who farm, who do their darndest to make the best food possible, but the system is really industrial, and that's where we get our food at the grocery store, at Walmart, at restaurants. That's where most of it comes from. So that's the majority of farming. Now, here you have, in the looking back kind of area, the farms that haven't kept up with the Joneses. Around here, there's a lot of dairies that just didn't keep up with the increasing automation of dairying, and they've kind of fell by the wayside, a lot of them. And so that's a small percentage of our food supply, the ones who didn't keep up, unfortunately. And farms like ours, small farms that kind of look forward, are on the other end of the graph. We're here. I'll call that trailing end of the graph Bankruptcy City because they've lost their ability to compete. And the forward end of the graph, I'm going to call Ulcer City. And I'll get to that in a minute. In the middle of the graph is the cozy sweet spot. It's also the cost sweet spot. The vast majority of people in developed countries are shopping in this zone. This is also a consumer graph where most consumers get their food. And most people shop on cost, and they go to the supermarket because it's simple and convenient and all those things. And remember, this graph is always moving forward as time progresses. So that hump in the middle is moving on its own, as well as the trailing edge. The farms are going out of business on the back edge. There's newer, more regenerative ways of small farming that are always leading on the leading edge. And in this big hump, some of those get incorporated into mainstream practices over long periods of time. What's it like to be on the small farm edge? Because this is the original question. And what it is Ulcer City. You're being speculative. You're guessing a little bit on what the future holds. So when I first started our farm, I was focused a lot on the availability of energy sources and how expensive energy was going to be and what it took to regenerate ground and build topsoil, those basic issues, and coming to a closer relationship with farming and nature, and the two being more harmonious. And that was a speculative venture on my part. Now, being both a realist, an idealist, and a businessman, those three things, my view's been tempered over our 11 years in farming, and I've thought of it more as a business venture than an idealistic venture. And I think that those who are realistic about having a small farm for the long term need to think in those terms. So what does it take to succeed as a small farm? It takes a differentiator starting out. You need to be able to differentiate yourself both from the supermarkets and the other competitors you're going to have. So you're going to be pounding that drum of how what you raise or grow is different. You're going to want to target your marketing that way. In other words, as I've said in old videos, you're not advertising in the local penny saver or shopper. You're not advertising on Craigslist. You're trying to focus your efforts toward your potential market audience. Now, who is your potential market audience? Well, let's look at the graph. Most of the people, probably 90% of the people, are shopping in this hump. They're in the sweet spot. The people that exist out on the front end of this graph are shopping for a couple different reasons. They're shopping from small farms for a couple different reasons. The first is they have an idealistic view of choosing the food they eat to match their idealism, whatever it may be, their morals, whatever it is, they're willing to pay more for it. They're foodies, they can be foodies, that are looking for something a cut above the normal fare. And typically, they're on the higher end of the pay scale. They have some disposable income that allows them to have the choice of not shopping at the cheaper grocery store. So you're marketing primarily to those people. What I've found in 11 years of doing this is that's a fairly stable endeavor. That customer base doesn't seem to fluctuate that much, at least where we're selling, whatever the economic conditions. That higher end of the middle class stays. And the higher middle class is where we're selling for the most part, although we sell to the spectrum. They're staying fairly stable through the economic ups and downs. A big part of this graph is the time bar. So those farms going out of business on the trailing end are farming more like the past, and their methods are going out. The people on the other end of the graph are looking to the future and preparing for the future and what the future may hold, and they're advertising that to their customer base. This is where my realist, non-conspiracy theorist personality comes in. I think that this food system that we have is a pretty resilient thing, because I look back at the past, and the thing that I've seen shake our food system the most was COVID, was the pandemic. Whatever you think of COVID, it shook the food system to its foundations. It vibrated is the term that I like to use, because supply and demand didn't match up, and the system is so finely tuned to that mechanism of supply and demand that it fell on its face for a while. But it didn't fall on its face for very long. It recovered. And my opinion is that technology is so good at adapting to what comes that it's going to keep doing that. That top part of the bell graph will stay the fat end. I do not think that small farms are going to do this on the leading end. They're going to hump up. I don't see the small farm movement as anything that's growing or shrinking. I think it's fairly stable because it serves that niche market, which is fairly unchanging. I don't see any calamity coming, even though there are lots of Chicken Littles out there that will tell you that there are. Something coming that rocks the food system, be it some social disorder, monetary issues, natural disaster, all that stuff, because the technology we have is so good at adapting to these things as they come along. The technology we have doesn't look ahead very far, and I always faulted that. What about what's going to happen in 30 years, 40 years, as far as energy supply, whatever the climate happens to do? It doesn't look that far ahead because it doesn't need to. It's gotten so good at adapting to things. Even now, I mean, you see more drought-resistant seeds coming out, different things being engineered. It is what it is. It just keeps marching along, and the idealist in me has shrunk as time's gone on because of that fact. As I said in the beginning of this video, the answer is yes and no. The small farms which have refused to adapt or been able to adapt are going by the wayside. The small farms on the other end of that bell curve that I showed, they're thriving. So it's yes and no. In contrast to the way society is normally accustomed to viewing things these days, which is this or that, small farms or big farms, my point is that it takes this and that to make a thriving food system. There's a role for the corporate industrial farms and for small farms too. And by the way, lots of people like to dehumanize those corporate industrial farms, but in reality, they're just the evolution of the small family farms. A lot of times it's the same family that owns that corporation, and they've just found ways to deal with continuing economic pressure and the advancement of technology to stay vital in the farming business. I think the way that small farms on the forward end of the curve stay vital is by continuing to push the envelope and raise awareness about good farming methods. A lot of the things that have been developed in the small farm sector in the past have come to be part of the big farm sector, the corporate farm sector. Things like organic and regenerative agriculture, the idea of pasturing animals, low stress lives for the animals. A lot of that came from the small farm sector, and our job as small farmers to continue pushing that envelope and also to be a repository of farming information in case something awful does happen. The more people that know how to farm, the more resilient and better off we are as a society and a world. I hope this video was informative. It's a level-headed approach to what's happening today. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.